I'd like to start by saying, and this is an old statement, that man's a funny animal. He can only read the writing on the wall when his back's up against it. But I'd like to ask the question, is our back far enough up against it yet? And from everything we've heard today, the answer is definitely not. I've got 2 grandchildren, and they'll still be alive in 2090. And that's just my grandchildren. That doesn't talk about my great-grandchildren or the grandchildren that I still don't have. And so my concern is for them. And where are we going to end up? Now, there's 2 ways that we can look at the world. There's a reductionist approach that says that things like desertification, climate change, biodiversity loss, etc. are problems. Or there's a holistic approach to looking at it to say that we've actually got environmental and social malfunction leading to desertification, climate change and biodiversity loss. And it's the distinction between those 2 things, the reductionist approach and the holistic approach, that I'd like to focus on first today. Now, reductionism is taking a complex system and saying it's equal to the sum of its parts. Now, an anatomist could get into your body and probably identify every bit of it, get down to the individual cells and even go to the DNA. But would they find your mind? Would they find your emotions? Would they find your soul? And obviously not, because you're much bigger than the sum of your parts. And so is everything in the universe. Everything in this universe is connected. And we've got to start looking at it in that way, rather than trying to break things down into their individual little bits. And I thought it might be instructive to have a look at a number of different parts of our lives today and look at the difference between looking at them from a reductionist point of view versus a holistic point of view. And if we take economics, we've got this economics growth at all costs throughout the world. But from a holistic point of view, we know that resources must limit growth. We've got a world financial system on the brink of collapse. But again, we know that resources will limit the growth that this world can produce. We've got economies and economists throughout the world that still think that Keynesian economics is something that we should be followed. Shoemaker wrote a book in the 1970s called Small is Beautiful, and he recognised back then that resource limitations would determine economic growth. And yet we've got economists around the world that think that perpetual growth is something that can happen. It's an impossibility. We've got this idiotic system called GDP, or gross domestic product. Do you know what contributes to that? The more crime we have, the higher our GDP is. The more people we got in hospitals, the higher our GDP is. The more car accidents we have, the higher our GDP is. It doesn't matter if the Darling Downs disappears under coal mines or gas, that doesn't affect GDP. What a ridiculous system. We look at law and policing. We've essentially got systems of blame rather than systems of prevention. We've got social responsibility instead of personal responsibility. When I was young, I remember that there used to be a thing called personal responsibility. I don't know where it's gone. Today, our societies rely on force rather than power. We've got illegal drugs instead of having purpose in life. And there was a statistic came out quite recently that said Australia is the 2nd highest user of recreational drugs in the world. And I reckon that's got something to do with the fact that we've got the best GDP in the whatever it is. All right, the 2 things go together. We've got larger police forces with guns and tasers. I remember when I was a kid, policemen had big boots and they were allowed to use them. We've got full jails where we don't have respect or self-esteem. And in terms of health, we understand we have a cellular and biochemical approach to the body. but it's a whole person that we've got to look at and treat. We've got a disease focus instead of an ill health focus. Instead of a health focus, rather. We've got health departments. We ought to be calling them ill health departments because that's what they're about. We treat symptoms rather than causes. We think that food is fuel rather than food being medicine. We've got prescription drugs instead of diet to fix up most of our problems today. Do you know last year, every 5.5 minutes, a type 2 diabetic was diagnosed in Australia. This year, that's happening every 5 minutes. And if we look at the environment, we think we know how the bits work. We have to manage for biodiversity. We're using 1.4 planets, and I noticed earlier Ian said 1.5 planets, and my data's based on 2009 numbers, so I'll go with 1.5 planets worth of resources annually to do what we're doing. And I almost said sustain, but I think sustainability is one of the most overused, abused words in our language. What we have to be focusing on is renewal. We've got to be going somewhere else, not sustaining where we're at. We think that humans are the top of the food chain. Humans are a part of the ecosystem, a very powerful part of it, but we are only a part of it. And we've got all this focus on reducing CO2. At the same time, we've got economic growth models. There is no way in the world that we can contain CO2, environmental degradation, or anything else until we change the economic system. And if we look at agriculture, very similar to medicine, we treat symptoms rather than causes. We think technology is going to be the cure of everything rather than managing for ecosystem services. We think that imbalance can be addressed with inputs, but a healthy ecosystem can balance itself. We study the minutiae instead of trying to understand the whole that we manage and how it's connected to everything else. And Wendell Berry once said that we've taken an elegant solution, which is grazing, and turned it into two separate problems. That's reductionism. We've got feedlots that have got all their attendant problems, and we've got growing crops which also have their attendant problems ecologically. Our generation is what I call the locust generation. We have consumed absolutely everything in front of us, and now we're 1.5 times into the world's resources. And we've already heard about the population growth that's on a J curve. We are now adding 1 billion people every 12 years to this planet. But in 1800, there was less than 1 billion people here. And why has that happened? It's happened because of cheap energy. The increase in population has been fueled by the moment the cheap energy we started to use it, coal and then oil. And that's fueled the technology, the agriculture, the medicine, and in the last 80 or 90 years, a whole lot of reductionist approach to how we run things. We've already heard today about peak oil. We haven't heard anything about peak phosphorus. This is scary for agriculture. It's scary for food production. We are already past peak phosphorus, but you never hear about that. Are we past peak ecological water? Absolutely. The Ogallala aquifer in the United States, which produces $20 billion of turnover a year, has about 25 to 30 years worth of water left in it. The Saudi aquifer is already on the way down. The North China Plain aquifer is currently feeding 200 to 300 million people. 15% of the Indian population are eating food produced from irrigation. 175 million Indians consume grain from wells that will shortly be exhausted. If we were to pick the one resource that's probably more scary than anything in the world, it's got to be water. Is there peak human health? You know, today's generation is the first generation in US history not expected to live longer than their parents. Is there peak agricultural land? We're currently losing agricultural land worldwide at the rate of 17 million hectares a year, and that is just to desertification and erosion. By the time you take away the loss of agricultural land from mining, national parks and urban development, it's a much greater number than that. So we've got a population doing that, and a land resource doing that, and a water resource on the same downward curve. Franklin Roosevelt once said that a nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. You could take that up a step and say that a world that destroys its soil destroys itself, and we're on that pathway. And let's look at the farming journey just over the last 100 years. The way in which we do infrastructure has changed significantly. Labour and the availability of labour and the type of labour we have has changed very significantly in the last 100 years. The way we irrigate, and we've already heard today of some of the changes that are occurring with irrigation, have changed significantly. The way we go about harvesting crops, you would think that's a lot more efficient. The way we muster livestock is very different and a lot more efficient. The way we transport is also a lot more efficient. But if you look up in the top right-hand photograph, you can see the reason why all of those things have happened. Every one of them has got to do with that fuel tanker. It's because of the increased use of fossil fuels that we've been able to use all that extra horsepower. But where's it got us? You can see that on the blue line, agricultural productivity increased right up until the 1990s. It has flatlined since the 1990s. But the terms of trade, that is, the profitability of farmers, is 1/3 of what it was in the 1950s. And it's probably flatlined at a level that it can't go any lower. The Queensland beef industry. In 9 of the last 10 years, the average beef producer in this country has spent more than they have earned. And we will not solve the problems of agriculture with the mentality which created them, to paraphrase Einstein. So we must become the regeneration. I like to look at an ecosystem in terms of a pie. And we've got carbon in that pie, ecosystem services, the water cycle, soil health, biodiversity and energy flow, which is how well we utilise sunlight energy. If we manage that pie effectively, we can grow the size of it. If we mismanage that pie, we will decrease the size of every element of that ecosystem. Now, it's impossible to be green and in the red. Farmers must make a profit. And where does that profit come from? Well, firstly, if I take the grazing industry, profit is a function of gross margin. Gross margin itself is a function of productivity, which is a function of nutrition, which is a function of pasture quantity and quality, which is a function of pasture management, which is a function of plant growth rate, which is a function of how well we utilise sunlight, rainfall and soil. 2 of those inputs are for free, which is then a function of ecological health. Everything in that pyramid affects profit of a farmer. And if you look at that, the whole base of that pyramid, if you're a grazier, is actually based around grass. So therefore, excuse me, our focus must be on grass. There are 3 new paradigms that I'd like to just share with you in the grazing industry. We heard Ruth say this morning that the grazing industry is 96% of the 80% of land that's under agriculture. Firstly, we've got to manage grazing, and I'll talk only very briefly about that. Secondly, I want to show you that trees are good. And thirdly, I want to talk very, very briefly about farming carbon. There's a number of grazing principles that we can use to make sure that we look after our land. Firstly, plants are like everything else. You, me, and every living organism, they need rest. We've got to match the stocking rate to the carrying capacity, just as we have to do with our globe. We've got to plan, monitor and manage what we do, so we're actually managing it rather than have it manage us. We've got to manage livestock effectively. We've got to look after their health, their nutrition, their water, etc. We've got to have minimum stock density for maximum time, maximum density for minimum time. This is the horsepower in any grazing system. And we've got to manage for biodiversity. And when we do that, we can achieve that middle plant. Now that's a grass plant that's actually been managed effectively for only 2 years. And you'll see the difference in the root system and the above ground part of that plant between the one on the left where it's been overgrazed, and that was only 10 metres away. We can achieve a great deal by looking after those plants using those principles. And in terms of trees, this is some data from Central Queensland. On brigalow that's got 40% canopy cover, the gross margin per hectare over the last 16 years has averaged $113. On land that's been fully cleared, the gross margin's averaged $84 a hectare. That farmer has lost $342 per hectare over 16 years, excluding the cost of clearing by taking out too many trees. The new paradigm there is that grazing management is the key, and we've got to separate a tree effect from a grazing effect. And very few people have ever seen a tree effect separated from a grazing effect. You look under a tree and you see bare ground and you say, oh, the tree did that. The reality most of the time is the animal, uncontrolled, actually did it. The last paradigm shift is carbon. And for the last 200 years, wealth has been transferred from rural Australia into the cities, what I call the big feedlots around the edge of Australia. In the next 100 years, that wealth has to come back from those cities back to the land, and the simplest way to get it back there is have a price on carbon and to get farmers to sequester carbon. And through the life cycle, we've got, through the process of birth, growth and reproduction, carbon goes into every living thing. When it dies, we lose carbon. Through the process of death and decay, we lose carbon back to the atmosphere again. All we've got to do is retain some of that carbon. And if you look at where carbon is in the atmosphere, we've got 750 gigatons of carbon. We've got 610 gigatons in all the vegetation on Earth. But our soils are 1,580 gigatons, more than the sum of all the carbon in the atmosphere and all the carbon in vegetation. The ocean's got a bit of carbon in it. We've got 4,000 gigatons of carbon still stored in fossil fuels. We're emitting about 5.5 gigatons of carbon a year. To me, it's not a big ask to take that 5.5 gigatons, or even the legacy load that we've heard a lot about today, and stick it away in that soil. And there's an example of carbon being sequestered. The dark stuff that you can see below those plants is actually carbon that's been taken out of the atmosphere and stored under those plants. Carbon can be measured very easily, and we end up with a map of carbon. That now is possible. I'd like to just finish by showing you an example of an ecological change. This is a paddock in central Queensland in 1995. By 1996, we changed management and it was galvanised burr on that site. By 1997, there was galvanised burr and a bit of bufflegrass. By 1998, there was more bufflegrass and still some galvanised burr. By 2002, it was all native bluegrass. That was achieved with wire, water and knowledge. No fertiliser, no seeding, no planting, nothing. And every ecosystem has the ability to respond like that. So I'd like to leave you with another Wendell quote: "You can best serve civilization by being against what it usually passes for."